Okay. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on East Asian security and international business. This webinar is sponsored by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is a project of the Universal Peace Federation. And we're very happy today to have a number of very distinguished panelists who have spoken on these issues many times in the past and have a lot of background. Today, I'd just like to introduce the moderator for the program, Dr. Michael Jenkins, who is the president of UPF in the United States. He is also the chairman of Washington Times Holdings, which is the owner of the Washington Times. He's a former director of the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative and the Middle East Peace Initiative. And he's worked on conflict resolution throughout his life, and is somebody that I deeply respect for his undying and unending enthusiasm to create a peaceful world. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Roger, and welcome to all of our guests who are joining us today for our International Association for Economic Development of the Universal Peace Federation, and today's title is East Asian Security and International Business. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., we're hosting a focus on the situation of the Korean Peninsula from the point of view of members of parliament or members of the US Congress, or as well as the State Department, people in intelligence. Also from the media point of view, we've hosted also academicians on this topic, and today's focus is on business. The situation surrounding the Korean Peninsula is one of increasing tension and economic stagnation. North Korean regime under Chairman Kim Jong-un has become even more insular under the threat of the COVID pandemic, shutting down its borders to all but essential traffic. Relationships have become between South Korea and Japan, Taiwan, China continue to be tense, and the new administration in the United States adds a little uncertainty to the issues of diplomacy and trade negotiations. So we are headed for a very exciting program today. One question will be, are we headed for a new Cold War, or are we headed for even a more difficult, tense relationship that could even be more dangerous? So I'd like to introduce our panelists today, just briefly. Colonel Al Short, also Mr. Ralph Cossa, and Mr. Gerard Willis. And I'll be introducing them individually, but we welcome to all of our panelists here. And I'd like to call them each one to give a brief presentation on their views of this topic. Colonel Al Short is partner of Global Resources Network, LLC. He has also has 40 years of experience in working constructively with foreign governments, international agencies, and NGOs. His areas of expertise include defense and security analysis, and as well as national level planning and accountability measures, effective technology transfer, and business development. I'd like to welcome at this time, Colonel Al Short.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Dr. Jenkins has really laid out the parameters for our discussion this afternoon, namely the potential for constructive business activity and its impact on prospects for peace, dialogue in East Asia, with emphasis on the Korean Peninsula. Now, in a previous session on Korean reunification and business development, in that discussion, I focused on the key role of business partnerships. A US or multinational firm should not go it alone, and a potential partner, in most cases, should be a robust ROK firm with a track record of dealing with the North. I also pointed out the role of NGOs, that's the soft side of business development, and also the significant contributions that religious groups in the South will make during any accommodation with the North. Now, having said that, I'm not optimistic in the short term that there'll be any significant opening in the North, and I'll attempt to bolster that assumption during my presentation. The thrust of my comments will be to highlight factors that I consider are in play in the political and business environment in North Asia. Due to time constraints, I'll make my points, and admittedly, in a lot of cases, not with a lot of supporting evidence, and we can get into that in the Q&A. One of the legacies of the Trump administration is that China has been, quote, outed. While this isn't necessarily new news, it's now in the forefront. And I don't think the Biden administration or anyone else can or wants to put the China genie back in the bottle. China has been outed for its actions in many areas, including those directly impacting on investment and especially supply chain management and general business activities. That doesn't mean that people will be abandoning business activities in and with China. But the new paradigm is, quote, China plus one. What does that mean? It means in the short term, you don't abandon your Chinese sources or your markets, but you're also looking concurrently at developing alternatives to sole sourcing from China. And that's in the marketplace. So who's going to be the beneficiaries of a China plus one approach? First of all, the countries in North Asia. Republic of Korea, Japan, and Taiwan will benefit directly. To a lesser extent, probably the countries in Southeast Asia, ultimately Japan and on from, India and on from there. This evolution is not going to be an on-off switch situation. It's going to be an evolutionary process, probably a decade long or longer, but the result will be others, not China, will benefit from investment that otherwise would have gone to China, but for the idea of China plus one. And of course, capital always seeks a secure landing place. Let's look at another evolving game changer, and that's the COVID crisis and beyond. A crisis always accelerates change, many of which have been in the works, but it brings them to the forefront. A crisis exposes old myths that have just been going on and not challenged. It accelerates new technology. It also accelerates political and economic activity. World War II is a good example of crisis accelerated change. Not only did we see significant technological increase, radar, aircraft, the bomb, we also had the demise of colonialism, which had been dying before, but it drove the spike in it. So the COVID crisis is going to accelerate change, and we have the China plus one scenario playing out at the same time. And why? Because China has restricted exports of certain materials and simply dominating a lot of the markets. When we contemplate this post-COVID business environment in Asia, a lot of things have and will change over the next decade. It will directly impact business investment decisions, as I've pointed out. Sourcing of raw materials, it'll influence production, distribution, and especially supply chain activities. Let's turn to North Korea for a bit. North Korea has had only 3 leaders in 75 years. So obviously the Kim family has been doing something right. Will the North change? Probably not. They've got a winning scenario from their narrow perspective. It's kind of the mouse that roared. China has always been this 500-pound gorilla in the North Korean situation. And if anything, there may be now the 1,000-pound gorilla given their enhanced political and economic position. And of course, the leader sets the tone, and the tone in Beijing has been, in some cases, quite belligerent. So what's Beijing's perspective on reunification, or can they accept any accommodation between the North and the South? Well, of course, first, the PRC is the economic and political benefactor and guarantor of the Kim regime. And that has not, and I don't think likely will not change. From the PRC standpoint, supporting the regime in Pyongyang is a loss leader, an economy of force operation. How does it benefit the PRC? It keeps the US focused on a problem in North Asia, while the PRC conducts its activities in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So keeping the North Korean pot boiling at a certain low level confounds the US and to a degree the ROK. But the PRC is not about to support open conflict on the Korean Peninsula. That wouldn't be in their interest. But, a low boil, that's fine. So why would China oppose a reunified Korea? First, the ROK, the South, would dominate in any reunification. They would economically and otherwise overwhelm the North. And it might even produce a democracy on the Yalu River, a shining light for the Korean minority in Manchuria. China has, extinguished democracy in Hong Kong. It threatens democracy in Taiwan, and the PRC surely does not want it on the Yalu to look at. Reunited Korea with a dynamic entrepreneurship and educated population in the South, combined with the raw materials in the North and ultimately a redeveloped North, would be an economic powerhouse to compete with China. Now, we all know that China and the ROK are robust trading partners, but the question is, what is China going to tolerate? So a reunited Korea would be a political beacon they don't want. It would be an economic competitor they don't want, and continuing the Kim regime and confronting the US, it's in their interest. On a cost-benefit basis, the PRC Korea strategy costs them relatively little and brings them significant benefits.
Mhm.
I don't want to be totally negative on reunification and business development, but I think you must be realistic. In my view, the potential for business activity in the short run is limited. Now, what should you do as a business executive or an entrepreneur? Think long term. Get a partner in South Korea, develop business in Northeast Asia now, and be in a position to move at such time as the opportunities arise. It's the old Boy Scout motto, be prepared. In summary, I've attempted to outline some of the factors influencing business development and decisions in the NEA over the next few years, which hopefully will spark a frank discussion by the other presenters and during the Q&A. Thanks very much, and over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Short. Excellent presentation, and you have a lot of experience in Asia, and we look forward to the discussion. At this time, I'd like to bring our next panelist, Mr. Ralph Cossa, who's the former president and Worldwide Support for Development Honda Chair at the Pacific Forum. He's a lifelong contributor to Comparative Connections and co-author of the Regional Overview Chapter. He's a member of the ASEAN Forum of Experts and Eminent Persons Group. He is a founding member of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, CSCAP, aimed at halting the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the Asia Pacific. He serves on the board of the prestigious Council of U.S.-Korean Security Studies and the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations in New York. He's a frequent contributor to Japan Times, Korea Times, and the International Herald Tribune. Let's welcome at this time Mr. Ralph Cossa. Welcome, Ralph. Go ahead, Ralph. I think you're muted. Roger, is there a way
Okay.
to mute?
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. They
Welcome, Ralph.
wouldn't allow me to unmute, so
That happened.
that's a bad sign, but I think we're all set now. Well, thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction. And let me start by saying that I am in about 97% agreement with everything that Al said. A couple of nuances that I'll mention as we're going along, but I think he set the stage extremely well. I want to maybe take a step back and take a little broader geopolitical approach. First, by answering the questions that were laid out. Are we heading for a Cold War with China and or a hot war with North Korea? The answers are yes and no. I think that we are already in a Cold War of sorts with China. Academics will spend the next 4 or 5 years debating whether or not we should use the term Cold War. But clearly, the US and China, if you take a look at the mix of cooperation and competition / confrontation, we are now much clearly in the confrontation and what I call constrainment mode. I would also point out that while I think the Trump administration made it worse, the real stimulus for this, the real activator for it has been Xi Jinping and China's policies. And as long as the Chinese, as they are doing today, insist that all of the fault rests with Donald Trump, then we're never going to be able to solve the problem. A little bit of self-criticism and self-reflection on the part of the Chinese would help the Biden administration come up with a more even-handed policy. But right now, I don't see the Chinese doing that. They seem to have a great deal of difficulty accepting that their own actions have consequences. And I think that makes it very difficult if you want to try to get the right balance of cooperation and competition. As far as North Korea is concerned, we spent the first 2 years of the Trump administration pretending that there was going to be a war. There wasn't. And we spent the last 2 years pretending that there was going to be denuclearization, which clearly there wasn't. Now we're back to the time-honored principle of kicking the can down the road while hoping for the best. I agree with Al that in the short term, there's very little prospect that we're going to see any kind of a breakthrough. One of the main problems right now is that when Joe Biden wakes up in the morning and looks at the 100 things I need to do, North Korea is not even on that list. Economy, and COVID are the first 50 items. And then, looking at things like rebuilding the alliances, which is a factor with South Korea, and other things, developing a broader strategy toward China, and then determining how North Korea fits into that. These are all things that have to happen before the administration is ready to open any doors with North Korea. Now, as I've said many times, the North Koreans don't mind being hated, but they hate to be ignored. So there may very likely be some action on the part of the North Koreans to sort of put themselves on the Biden agenda. That's probably not a good idea. As a general word of advice to other countries, it's never good to be the first one to test a new administration because it sort of forces them to take a hardline policy, which then it becomes very difficult to get off of. But I think right now, the main concern with solving the North Korea problem, again, as Al mentioned, is that China has really no interest in serving it. While China and the US, our short-term objectives overlap, we both want to see no war on the peninsula, and we would prefer a nuclear-free peninsula. Our long-term objectives are clearly different. The US, and I think most of the free world, sees eventually North Korea peacefully dying in its sleep and going away. If we knew how to make that happen, it would have already happened, but we're still sort of hoping for that. And a unified Korean Peninsula under the political, economic, and social system that we see in Seoul today. The Chinese do not want that. The Chinese accuse Americans of having a Cold War mentality. I accuse China of having a 19th century mentality. They still seem to value the idea of a North Korean buffer zone, as Al said, not wanting a democracy on the Yalu River. But in this day and age, this day of cyber and of long-range weaponry, the concept of a buffer zone is really kind of archaic. Nonetheless, I think the Chinese continue to stick with it. The real challenge for the US and South Korea right now is that, as I mentioned, from Joe Biden's perspective, this is a sort of a lose-lose situation. And when you're faced with one of those, you try to put it off as long as possible. From a South Korean perspective, Moon Jae-in has a year left on his term. He very much would like to be the president that solves the North Korea problem, or at least creates a peaceful coexistence between the North and the South. So his clock is ticking while we're still winding the US clock. That's gonna, I think, make it extremely difficult. Where I would agree with Al is that one of the smart things that we should be doing is sort of, investing in South Korea, investing in other areas. Where I would slightly disagree, I would say that Japan initially, and then Taiwan and South Korea were the past as far as economic cooperation, as far as development at least is concerned. China is the present, but Vietnam and Indonesia are the future. So possibly is India, if it can ever get its act together. We've been saying India is a country with great potential now for the last 50 years, and we're still waiting for it to actually reach that potential. But I think that the natural order of things is, and this has been accelerated by Chinese behavior, the natural order of things will be, as we used to go to Japan. When I started out in Asia, we went to Japan to buy cheap goods. The yen was 360 to the dollar, for those of you old enough to remember that. Then it was Taiwan and South Korea. Now it's China. But if you take a look at the business environment in China, which is rule by law, and then you take a look at the business environment in somewhere like Vietnam, which is rule of law, it makes a lot more sense to be investing in the future in places like Vietnam, even Indonesia, because it's a more solid business environment. In the meantime, if you've ever tried to buy property or even rent an office in Shanghai, it's about as expensive as renting one in New York. So China is sort of pricing itself out of existence at the same time as the intellectual property right issues and other issues are making it more and more difficult to do business there. Everyone's not going to flee China overnight, but I do think that you're going to see more and more firms moving. If you go to Vietnam today, you can't help but run into Taiwan businessmen. They've been in there big time for 20 years now, and they see that as the future. And normally, if you want to follow the money, you follow the Taiwan money, and you can get a pretty good idea of where future investments ought to be. In the meantime, to just wrap up with a couple more words about China, I think the reason that we're on a collision course, and my Chinese friends object to this comment vehemently, is that Xi Jinping has overseen the death of Deng Xiaoping thought. If you'll recall, Deng, who I consider to have been the man of the 20th century, really put China on a path. His famous bromide, of course, was, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. It still doesn't matter if the cat is black or white in China, as long as he subscribes to Xi Jinping thought. We've seen Deng wanted to sort of phase out state-owned enterprises. Xi has breathed new life into them. Deng was afraid of another Mao and instituted collective leadership and term limits. Xi has overdone both of those. Deng Xiaoping also laid out a formula for Hong Kong that he hoped would one day apply in Taiwan, one country, two systems. Xi Jinping has been nailing more and more nails into that coffin. And of course, today they've put the final nail, and there's very little prospect at all of Hong Kong being a model for anything other than demonstrating how China reneges on its international agreements, including a formal treaty certified by the UN between China and the UK with the turnover of Hong Kong. So, if you cut a deal with the Vietnamese, that's your deal and you move forward. If you cut a deal with the Chinese, that's tomorrow's bargaining position as the Chinese then start whittling away a little bit more. So I think that, as I said, and I'll leave with this thought, China may be the present, but I see places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and potentially India as the future as far as economic development is concerned. And in North Korea, I think we're going to continue to kick the can down the road and hope for the best. And it's going to be, at best, some sort of unpeaceful coexistence between the North and the South as we move forward. So let me stop there. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Ralph. I think your commentary is very, very important, and also seeing the Deng Xiaoping versus Xi Jinping developments and the different focus is really important to understand. At this time, we'd like to introduce Mr. Gerard Willis. He's chairman of HJ Magnolia Korea Foundation, as a charitable organization that serves as the holding company for quite a number of conglomerates in and throughout Asia. He's based in Asia since 1988. He's been the general counsel and transactional attorney and business leader for Fortune 100 companies, also Wall Street law firms, and a private direct investment fund. Most recently, he was vice president and general counsel of Asia Pacific for Honeywell International, a diversified technology company with over $7 billion of annual revenue in Asia. Gerard has direct experience of successfully working with the Chinese government and also the regulations and laws there, and doing successful business with Honeywell. I'd like to welcome at this time Mr. Gerard Willis.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for that introduction. As you mentioned, I have spent the past 30 years working and living in China as an attorney and a business person. Currently, I live in Korea, as Dr. Jenkins mentioned, where I am the chairman of a diversified a business conglomerate with interests in construction, stoneworks, hotels, resorts, automotive, real estate, and specialty chemicals. But in my last job in China, over a 12-year period, our company increased its annual revenues from $300 million a year to $3 billion. I actually find it extraordinarily easy to do business in China. It's a different system and method, as pointed out. Often contracts signed are only the beginning of long-term negotiations. But in my experience, conflicts that arise in implementing those conflicts are almost always capable of being resolved through patient and reasonable negotiations with Chinese counterparts. In fact, leading to better outcomes often than you would find in the United States, where litigation is the quick and easy alternative in a dispute. I'm not experienced with government-to-government negotiations, and that may be a completely different kettle of fish. But certainly in the business realm, many of the problems that Western companies have in China, I feel, are based perhaps not on fully understanding a different way of making decisions and solving problems. Clearly, no one would live and work in China for as long as I have if they didn't like it. Indeed, in my time in China, I developed the greatest respect and interest and affection for the Chinese people and an appreciation of their contributions to world civilization. I believe China is capable of making positive, even decisive contributions to peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, and more generally in Northeast Asia, should it choose to do so. Indeed, I would say that without China's involvement and willing support, a lasting peace in Northeast Asia will be difficult to achieve. Chinese leaders have been known to describe their relationship with North Korea as one of teeth and gums. So given such a relationship, what are the prospects that Beijing can be engaged as a partner for peace and development on the peninsula? In order to better understand the prospects for engagement with China, let's look at China's historical and current interests in Korea. First, cultural. From prior to the 20th century, Korea was China's closest ally. In many ways, Korea was the model of Chinese expectations regarding its client states and what we now call the Chinese East Asiatic system, where China sat in the center and contiguous countries revolved around it, like planets around the sun, both paying economic tribute to China and emulating Chinese political and social norms. In fact, Korea enthusiastically embraced that model. Secondly, ideological. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of ideology in the conduct of Chinese foreign policy, but I don't want to ignore it either. During the Soviet era, the role of ideology in Soviet decision-making waxed and waned, and in the end, played a subordinate role to national interests. At the very least, however, ideology is the background noise in any discussion of peace in Northeast Asia. If a nation believes that its fellow inhabitants on this planet can never be trusted because of their social systems, developing a common approach to peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia will be a challenge. Third, great power rivalry. Since even before the Treaty of Westphalia, nation states have jockeyed for power and position within the international system. And before that, back as far as the Greeks and Persians, empires have clashed for geopolitical advantage. China considers North Korea vital to its security, leaving many to believe that China is committed to the status quo rather than any solution to the division and hostility on the Korean Peninsula. In short, Korea has an interest in keeping the US or any other foreign power from dominating the Korean Peninsula. It considers among its obligations that of maintaining a fellow socialist government. And for reasons both of power and prestige, it is not likely to lead the field. On a positive note, however, China has shown willing, within limits, to act in support of the global community. China has, though perhaps with reservations, participated in the UN sanctions on North Korea. China is worried, rightly, of the effect a new Korean war, whether conventional or nuclear, would have on their own future and economic growth. Indeed, China claims that one reason it is justified in supporting North Korean government and military is that if the country were to collapse, the resulting chaos would spread across its border with North Korea into China itself, affecting China's social stability and economic success. I would not be a supporter of IAED if I was not an idealist. Although China's relationship with North Korea is complex and finely tuned, I believe a solution can be found, and the search for a solution should start with a simple appeal to human decency. China has raised more people out of poverty in a shorter period of time than any country in human history. It is seeking to spread the wealth, although serve its own security interests at the same time, through its Belt and Road initiatives with other countries. Surely even the most hard-eyed realist in Beijing must wonder whether it is keeping with its new status on the international stage to see a fraternal nation on its own borders mired in abject poverty. North Korea's GDP in 2015, the last year for which we have reliable data, was 40 billion US dollars. South Korea's was 1.6 trillion, 40 times that of North Korea. 43% of North Korea's population is undernourished. The situation, a likely source of instability in a region important to China and the world, can be remedied by collective action, but it will require cooperation of all concerned to craft a settlement that opens the North Korean economy to the world. For that to happen, there must be some kind of security settlement. That is an exchange of the false and impoverishing security of nuclear weapons for a genuine security guarantee, followed by global cooperation to enhance the North Korean economic development. Currently, China is North Korea's biggest trading partner at an average of 1.5 billion a year, although it fell to only $500 million in this last year of COVID. But that is a drop in the bucket to China's overall trading situation. One study has indicated that economically, united Korea could rival GDP of Japan and Germany by 2049. That is the fruit that a peaceful and prosperous Korea could bear. I realize I've raised more questions than answers, but I hope I've offered you a reasonable framework to think through some of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, and thank you to all of our panelists. At this time, we have some questions from our audience, and I would like to present them to you. This one, I'd like each one of our panelists to comment on. And that is from Mr. James Edgerly. What have the impacts of trade restrictions with the US been from the Chinese perspective? Are they having any real impact, pushing the Chinese government to become any more flexible with regards to trade policy? Who would like to weigh in on that? Again, what are the impacts of the trade restrictions with the US? And has that really caused the Chinese government to be any more flexible about their trade policy? Who would like to address that one? Gerard?
Oh, sure. And Mr. Edgerly, I'm not steeped in the specifics of the trade issues on the macro scale. On a more micro scale, I had some real problems with the Trump administration's approach to negotiations. Typical in a US context of banging the table and threatening to walk away, and in fact walking away at a certain point. And I think that shocked the Chinese and led to an adverse reaction. The real, success of negotiations with China requires extreme patience, lots of time, and really understanding their needs and interests, which very often are different than our own. Deals are often possible with the Chinese because their expectations and concerns are quite different from ours and vice versa. In other words, it's sometimes, when you understand it, possible to solve for both sides. Having said that, I certainly believe in reciprocity, and that's been lacking in certain respects in our trade policy. So these are complicated questions, Mr. Edgerly, but I think one that, as our fellow panelists will note, the Biden administration is going to have to grapple with sooner rather than later.
Ralph?
Yeah, I would very much agree with what Gerald has just said. I think that the Trump administration actually, particularly under previous Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, really got China right in some respects. And the demand for reciprocity was the key word in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. That was changed in the last 2 years by tariffs, and the evil of the Chinese Communist Party under Mike Pompeo, which is what I think sort of started the Cold War and was particularly unhelpful. If you attack someone's behavior, there's a chance that they might change their behavior if the incentives are great enough. If you attack their political legitimacy, which is what Pompeo was doing with his anti-communist party rhetoric, then the chance of cooperation becomes extremely slim. So I think that while Dr. Trump's diagnosis was correct, there was a need for reciprocity, and China was not living up to its own agreements. His bedside manner was atrocious, and I think that contributed to the problem. I would also, to build on what Gerald said, I think the real key in approaching China is not to demand that China live up to our ideals or our expectations, but that they live up to their own promises and written agreements. There were agreements under which China joined the WTO. If somebody really believes they've honestly lived up to all of them, then we're going to have a problem, I guess, in discussing this. That's not to say the US has lived up to all of its agreements either, and we should be held accountable where we haven't. But I think the real approach that we need to take in the future with China is to insist that they live up to their own promises, their own written agreements. That applies to Hong Kong as much as it applies to trade arrangements. Thanks.
Thank you. Colonel Short?
Trade restrictions are the hammer. And it's something that should be used with I think, extreme care, and just not first out of the block. You lay down this démarche. As was pointed out by both the other speakers, reciprocity is key to this process. But let's face it, the PRC has a blotted copybook, and they need to clean it up. As was mentioned, the WTO basically violations, their recent activity in Hong Kong. It does not bode well for, trust and confidence in the ability to negotiate and to come to a conclusion that will be implemented. So there has to be, I think, a bit of a rethink of their long-term objectives in Beijing. If reciprocity is going to work, reciprocity means both sides have to cooperate, not only in the negotiations, but more important, in the implementation. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel. We have a question from Scott Solman for Gerard Willis. Mr. Willis, what safeguards, if any, have your businesses in China had to implement to protect from intellectual property theft?
That's an excellent question. And again, if I could pop some of the myths, it is possible to protect intellectual property in China. The difference is, in the United States, you rely solely on the law. In China, you need a multifaceted approach involving law, relations with employees, security protocols with respect to disclosure of certain information, keeping certain of your your crown jewels offshore, and just later in the production process, sourcing in China. I wrote actually a book about this thick on protecting intellectual property in China. It is very possible, and I got my company, Honeywell, which is a world-renowned technology company whose intellectual property is key to its success and survival, comfortable with doing so. Now, if you don't put if you don't put the time and attention into doing that and simply expect things to work the way they do in the United States, yes, you're going to be very disappointed. But so it is possible to do so, in my experience.
Thank you. Sheikh Ramzi from the United Kingdom writes, we should pray for unity between USA and China. And we'd like to see what possibilities are there for USA and China to have a better working relationship. And I might add to this, I'd like Ralph to comment on this, but I might add to this, we do see the reality that Xi Jinping has moved back to the basic ideology of communism, and he's enforcing a number of things that way in terms of relationships, and it causes them, from everything I read and understand, that China does not see a possibility of friendship with America because they really believe that America is an enemy. Ralph?
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, I think our policies over the last couple of years have made it worse. There are areas where the two countries have clear interest. Global warming actually is one of them, and this administration puts a much higher premium on that than others. Obviously, North Korea, again, as we've all discussed, is an area where, at least in the near term, we have overlapping objectives. And as one of the other speakers mentioned, we can't solve many of the problems in the world without some form of cooperation between the US and China. But it's got to be clear-eyed cooperation. We have to find the right mix between cooperation and what I call constrainment, or constraining China, not containing. I think that's again a 19th or 20th century phenomenon, but constraining, sort of putting the barriers. And here things like the Quad, the U.S. still sort of informal grouping of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, is a step in the right direction, as long as it focuses on the positive. Right now, the Chinese argue that the Quad is aimed against China. The proponents of the Quad say that the Quad is promoting the rule of law, freedom of navigation, a free and open Indo-Pacific. And my response to China is, if those things are deemed to be anti-China, if the shoe fits, wear it. Again, this is a focus on Chinese behavior.
Thank you, Ralph.
There are legitimate concerns, and nothing and something we have to deal with.
Thank you very much, Ralph. This is a very good discussion. For any of the panelists, how has China's continued push for world economic and military dominion, specifically in Southeast Asia, affected business relationships in the region? How has China's push for world economic and military dominion affected business relationships in the region? One thing I might add is we had a very special webinar on the South China Sea and the steps that China has been taking to control the sea lanes there. And it is quite a challenge for many of the nations there, including the US. How about Colonel Short? Would you like to address that?
Well, I think China's actions, as was pointed out by Ralph, have precipitated the concept of China plus one. You don't abandon China as a source for supply or a market, but you look at alternatives. And over time, I think it's going to positively influence, in a positive sense, Southeast Asia. You know, dollars will go where there's a good environment, where you have protections and where you can make a profit. If China creates a situation where it's difficult to do business or more difficult than somewhere else, that capital will go elsewhere. I think, as was pointed out, India, if it ever gets their act together, could be a major beneficiary of a China plus one. It's kind of like Brazil. We've all been waiting for the takeoff. You know, this is old Huntington, development theory. But the takeoff, they're still on the runway. They haven't taken off in that sense. So I think because of the perhaps more truculent activities of China over the last few years has created a situation where international business is looking at alternatives. You're always looking at options, and you're always going to put your money where it's got the greatest security, first of all, and second, the greatest rate of return. And China is an expensive place to operate, as was pointed out. Renting in Shanghai costs as much as in Wall Street. So I think, as I think Ralph also mentioned, the future may be in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and even around the corner in Bangladesh, and to a degree in India.
Next question is, what would be the possibility of creating a situation of North and South Korea coming together in a way that would not threaten China? And I think it's important that Gerard noted that the GDP of a combined Korea may rival Japan and also Germany by 2049. So this is a very good question from our audience. How about Gerard?
Well, I mean, that is the question, is how do you bring China to the table in a constructive way to discuss the future of North Korea? Again, I'm not expert in the government to government talks of the past, where Ambassador Christopher Hill played an important role. Clearly, China is wary and careful. But as I suggested, there are economic benefits to a united Korea as a trading partner for China. There are security benefits. How long can a situation like this last without eventually either breaking or spinning out of control to the disadvantage of all concerned? And I think simply repeating those issues and arguments and seeking to engage China, at least perhaps can uncover some common interests that allow us to begin to make constructive proposals jointly to the South and North that can facilitate negotiations.
Can China and the United States and South Korea and other UN nations discuss human rights in a way that will improve the human rights situation in China? particularly with religious minorities? Is there a way to engage in dialogue? A lot of times the dialogue has just been completely taken off the table because it's like discussing Taiwan's independence. China will pull out of any discussion about that. How about on human rights? How can the US, China, and South Korea engage on human rights and make it part of the progress towards a better China and a better world? Ralph, you have any insights on that, or Colonel Short?
I mean, I guess I could give a one-word answer, and the answer is no. I'm not sure there is a way that we can engage with China and North Korea to discuss the human rights issue. I think, unfortunate as it may be, we actually have to, as other administrations have done, have to sort of put that aside if we really want to move forward with North Korea. If I could, let me just mention two things from the previous questions. Number one, I'm actually working on a project right now with Chinese colleagues on trying to develop at least an interim long-term objective that the US and China can both agree upon regarding North Korea. And I think until the US and China can come up with overlapping objectives, it's very hard to find cooperation or find a solution that China is going to accept. And on the previous question, I would advise everyone to read a book called The China Dream by Colonel Liu Mingfu. He sort of lays out the China plan. I don't think China's plan today is for global domination. I think the plan is first China has to get its act together. 2021 was the year that was settled for that. Then it needs to be in a position to dominate Asia, which is where I think it's working now. And then by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, of China, People's Republic of China, that's when sort of global domination is to play. So I would recommend that book. It's very instructive, and we're told that Xi Jinping is a great believer in this book.
Michael, perhaps we can come back to one point, because I think when you talk about accommodation between the North and the South, my wife, I ran my notes by her last night, and she said, "You're totally negative. There's got to be some way that you can start to open the door." And I admit it's been tried before with not too much success, whether that's NGO to NGO or whether that's business to business. But baby steps on accommodation between the South and the North. Now, the North has tried them and rejected them. We had, the common manufacturing facilities, we had tourists, we had family reunions. But, times do change, and it's a low cost, no cost alternative to try to begin at a low level to build bridges North and South. Churches are a key matter in that. NGOs are key, and even business. But don't give up because it hasn't worked before, I think is the adage here.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Short. We've got people from all over the world on this call. From Finland, we have Mr. Makanen, who asks or mentions Mr. Trump understood the threat of China and concern with the 5G communication. And the new president, Mr. Biden, may understand, but his hands seem to be tied. Can some of the panelists comment on the issue of control over the communication arena? Gerard?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think Americans generally, again, I don't speak to our government intelligence agencies or security establishment, but we're a little slow to understand how incredibly advanced certain areas of the Chinese economy are, especially in development of technology. Their leading companies have absolutely remarkable technology, definitely competitive with the United States, in some respects better. I know our company was as interested in doing projects with Chinese companies to learn from them as not just simply to contribute its own technology. So it's I think vital for the United States to take a heightened interest in that area. I know there are leaders in Congress and in the government generally who are pushing very, very hard to make that a joint effort and coordinated effort among American technology companies to be able to compete as the Chinese do in a coordinated way in those areas, in particular 5G. And I think if we don't, then China will continue to advance more quickly than we expect. I mean, that's been the lesson of the last 15 years. Things move quicker there than we expect. They very often hit an inflection point and just take off in a particular industry or area of technology. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that and respond with policies that facilitate our own companies, help our own companies to respond to that challenge.
Thank you. One Belt, One Road is a vision, and it's being implemented by China throughout Asia, all the way to Europe and down through Africa. And also it has a vision to expand that One Belt, One Road throughout all of the world. And there are a lot of advancements occurring where China's building railroads, bridges, cities almost around the stopping points on the One Belt, One Road. Everybody was very interested. It seemed to be really a sincere promotion of trade and development. But at the same time, we're finding now that many African nations are finding themselves in a debt trap where they sign documents for the development of their ports or the development of the railroad in their nations. And the payment terms they believed would be paid by the profits from the One Belt, One Road development did not pay the debt. And then China has been actually taking over that land or that area. Any thoughts on One Belt, One Road? And what are the concerns you have in terms of China keeping its promises, its commitments to those countries, and also in relationship to the United States for fair and even trade?
Let me just make one comment on it. One view of the Belt and Road is this is a new colonialism. Depends on which way you're looking at it. If you're the recipient, there's some interesting financing on a lot of these projects. I've spent a number of years dealing with Pacific Islands, which are all economically weak, remote, and we know all the issues. The PRC has been loaning money to Pacific Island nations that has under terms that are, it just don't work. And so once the loan defaults, you're at their mercy, and then they come in with their list of non-negotiable demands. So in one sense, this may be the new colonialism. Another aspect of this is it's a very expensive proposition for China. Can they afford to be building everywhere, everything all the time? I don't know, but someone has to look at a return on investment on this besides the political return.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could add maybe a couple of quick comments.
Sure.
Number one, I was very amused a couple of years ago when the first opening between China and the Philippines, and the headlines in the Philippine newspapers was of the billions and upon billions of dollars that China was going to pump into the Philippine economy. No one's seen that yet. So the Chinese are great at promises, but nobody seems to be following through very well. The other interesting point, I gave a series of lectures in East Timor a couple of years ago. And the question that I got from every audience, and this is sort of paraphrased, was, how do we continue to get Chinese money without getting all these damn Chinese? What happens is, the Chinese built a beautiful foreign ministry building in Dili. They brought in 300 Chinese workers. And 150 of them stayed and started opening up small businesses. And, there's also 150 men for every 100 women in China. So many of them are looking to settle there and find a bride. So the sort of other unintended consequence of having Chinese come in and help develop is that sometimes you end up with a lot more Chinese than you bargained for.
Thank you, Ralph. Our time has run out. I really want to thank each panelist, Mr. Gerard Willis, Mr. Ralph Cossa, and also Colonel Albert Short. It's been a tremendous experience. There are dozens of questions coming in from all over the world. I particularly want to thank Mr. Willis for his encouragement that you can work out things with China if you're patient. And they've been working on things for 5,000 years. We need to get a little bit longer range of patience, but at the same time protecting freedom and also prosperity for all people. I want to thank you. I'd like to bring our host back, Mr. Roger Weatherall, for instructions for the future. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. Give them your heartfelt thanks. Thank you, everyone. Roger?
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And again, really appreciated all of the insights and the commentary that people provided. We will be continuing to hold these events every week with different associations of UPF sponsoring these events. So please bookmark this or put a calendar reminder on your calendar for these, and we will send out announcements about each event. There's also a link that I'm putting into the chat window if you want to sign up for our email newsletter so that you can stay informed if you're not already on the list. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.